A tank doesn't belong on a record label logo. It belongs on a battlefield, armor plating, a gun turret, the kind of machine built to take a direct hit and keep rolling forward. But in 1998, that tank was on the back of millions of albums, standing guard over a hip-hop empire that at its peak was moving product faster than almost any label in America. 7 years earlier, almost none of that existed. There was a storefront in Richmond, California, a 20-year-old named Percy Miller behind the counter, selling cassette tapes out of a shop he'd bankrolled with money that came from losing someone in his family. He called the shop No Limit Records and Tapes. He wasn't selling to a label. He was the label, the distributor, the clerk, the artist on some of the tapes in the bin. This is the story of how that storefront became that tank, and how more than a decade later a bankruptcy filing that should have ended it all somehow didn't sink it either. The question isn't how Master P built No Limit, it's how he kept surviving the moments that were supposed to finish him. Percy Miller had grown up in New Orleans' Calliope housing projects, spending much of his childhood with his grandparents. In the 1990s, his brother Kevin was killed back in New Orleans, and whatever pull the city still had on him, that loss pushed him further away from it, not closer. Richmond was distant. Richmond was a clean slate. Richmond was where nobody already had an opinion about who Percy Miller was supposed to be, so he built from zero. No Limit Records and Tapes wasn't just a storefront. It was a distribution hub for artists who couldn't get shelf space anywhere else. Bay Area rap had built its own independent economy in the early 90s, with trunk sales, independent retailers, and mixtapes moving music outside the major label system. Miller's shop became part of that circuit, stocking and selling local and regional acts alongside his own tapes. And he was making those tapes constantly. Mind of a Psychopath followed in 1990. His solo album, Getaway Clean, followed in 1991. Neither one arrived like an event. They moved like inventory, out of a trunk of a car and off the shelf of his own store, one tape at a time. There was no A&R department, no major label radio push, no one else to blame if it didn't work, and no major label to split the money with if it did. By 1994, the shop had quietly become something else, a label with a growing release schedule, a small but loyal following, and a founder who'd learned nearly every part of the business by doing it himself, out of necessity, in a city that was never supposed to be the story. In 1995, Percy Miller moved No Limit back to New Orleans, the city he'd spent years building a business away from. The reason wasn't just sentiment, it was momentum. The Ghetto's Trying to Kill Me, released the year before, had done something none of his earlier releases had. It had become a genuine independent success, selling hundreds of thousands of copies without a major label machine behind it. That number doesn't sound like a hit single, it sounds like a hit business. But a business built around the Bay Area had a ceiling. If Miller wanted to scale, he needed to build around the markets and culture he knew best, New Orleans. So he relocated No Limit back to New Orleans, bringing his existing artists with him, while serving a growing roster of local talent. Mystical, Mia X, Kanan Abel, and Mr. Servon. This wasn't a founder returning in triumph, it was a founder consolidating the business around a sound and a market he now understood how to sell. The proof came fast. Down South hustlers, bouncing and swinging, a compilation pulled together voices from the roster, became an important early breakthrough, connecting No Limit's growing operations to the southern audience it was now building around. The cadence, the slang, the regional identity, that was home court advantage, and it showed up on the charts. For the first time, Percy Miller wasn't just selling tapes out of a shop. He was sitting on something the majors were starting to notice, which meant the next decision, whether to sell that piece and on what terms, was about to define everything that came after it. By the mid-90s, Master P had a decision most independent artists never get the chance to make. A major label was ready to make him an offer. Interscope's Jimmy Iovine reportedly offered him a deal worth around $1 million. On paper, that's not a number you turn down, especially for someone who started with $10,000 from a settlement check. But Master P has said he did the math differently. If a label was willing to pay him $1 million for the music, he reasoned the actual value, the thing he'd built, the ownership, the catalog, had to be worth far more than that. So instead of giving up ownership of his masters for an upfront check, he negotiated something rarer, a distribution deal with Priority Records in the mid-90s that allowed No Limit to retain ownership of its recordings. Priority would handle the manufacturing and distribution, while No Limit remained responsible for much of its own marketing, promotion, and recording costs, allowing the label to retain ownership of its master recordings and a substantial share of the revenue. The exact split has been reported differently across interviews and retrospectives, somewhere in the neighborhood of an 80 to 85% 100% cut, staying with No Limit. But the structure, not the precise number, is what mattered. Priority got a piece of a hit machine. Master P got to keep owning the machine. It's a distinction that sounds technical until you follow the money forward. Owning the masters meant that the recordings remain an asset that can continue to generate income through licensing, reissues, compilations, and other uses long after the original release. Most artists in 1996 didn't have the leverage to treat their catalog as a long-term asset. Master P was building his business around the assumption that he could. Once the Priority deal was signed, No Limit stopped operating like a conventional record label and started operating like a factory. The output was relentless. Where a major label might carefully space out a handful of releases a year, No Limit pushed dozens, sometimes a new album every few weeks, flooding record store shelves with product before competitors could even respond. In-house producers, beat by the pound, built much of the label's sonic identity, giving No Limit a consistent, recognizable sound across the roster that kept growing. Silk the Shocker, Mystical, C Murder, Mia X, Fiend, Cain and Abel, and in 1998 the label pulled off one of its most consequential moves, signing Snoop Dogg, a bona fide West Coast icon, to a southern rap label that had only recently established itself as a national force. The volume wasn't just about keeping No Limit visible, it spread the risk. One artist didn't have to carry the company. If one album stalled, another could take its place the following month. And because No Limit controlled so much of the process, every successful release helped finance the next one. And the tank itself became the label's mascot, its visual signature, its whole battlefield metaphor made literal, the No Limit soldiers, the tank rolling across cover after cover, the sense that this wasn't just a roster, it was an army. The business results were staggering, at least by Master P's own account, more than $100 million a year in revenue at the label's peak, with No Limit's catalog eventually being credited with tens of millions of records sold. But even without relying on those estimates, the shelf presence was undeniable. By the late 90s, you could walk into almost any record store in America and find the tank staring back at you from multiple covers at once. No Limit hadn't just built a label, it had built a machine that never stopped producing, which was exactly the kind of machine that was about to become very hard to keep running. Quick interruption. If you want more stories about the companies and brands that built the culture around us, subscribe. Now back to the story. No single event ended No Limit. It was several pressures arriving at once, and none of them let up. The first was Master P himself, pulled towards something the label had never given him, a shot at professional basketball. Between 1998 and 2002, he chased that dream seriously. A stint in the CBA, preseason contracts with the Charlotte Hornets and Toronto Raptors. It's worth being precise here. He didn't step away from No Limit entirely, but the label's founder and public face was now splitting his attention with the sport at exactly the moment the industry was shifting under him. The second pressure was the competition, and it was local. Cash Money Records, another New Orleans label built on similar independent ownership principles, was breaking through with a sound that felt current, where No Limits increasingly felt repetitive. The same rapid release strategy that once flooded the market now carried a different risk, diminishing returns. When you're pushing releases that pace across a large roster, maintaining the same level of quality becomes harder. The third pressure was internal. A label built around one family with dozens of artists cycling through was always going to face friction, and No Limit did, with roster departure and reporting lawsuits compounding the early 2000s as some of its biggest names left for other deals. None of these alone would have ended a label this large. Together, they did. Sales declined through 2000 and 2001. In 2003, No Limit Enterprises filed for bankruptcy, with court filings reported millions of dollars in liabilities. The tank, for the first time, had taken a hit it couldn't just roll through. On paper, that's the end of the story. The empire that flooded the market finally ran out of room to run. Master P has never described it this way. In later interviews, he's described the filing less as a collapse and more as a restructuring, a process that allowed him to address the company's obligations while preserving what he believed mattered most. And it's worth holding both things at once. The debts were real, the label did fold, and the man at the center of it spent 2 decades insisting it was a choice as much as a defeat. Maybe the honest answer is that it was both. A business in real trouble, run by someone who'd built his career around refusing to let other people write the ending. What happened next undercuts the idea that this was simply an ending. The original No Limit business was gone, in the form that had made it famous, but Master P didn't disappear. He relaunched No Limit as New No Limit Records in 2004, and later as No Limit Forever, continuing to build in music, film, and in businesses far beyond the original label. And the blueprint outlived the bankruptcy filing that supposedly ended it. The idea that an independent artist could retain ownership, negotiate favorable distribution terms, and keep more of the upside, that wasn't just a No Limit story anymore. It became part of an independent music playbook. The very label that helped push No Limit into decline built its own empire on a similar ownership structure. The same logic would later appear in other corners of music, as artists and genres far removed from southern rap increasingly treated ownership and control as assets worth protecting. The Tank didn't survive because the label never took damage. It survived because the ideas underneath the label, ownership, control, and the ability to rebuild, outlasted the company itself. That may be the real legacy of No Limit. Not that Master P found a way to make a record label impossible to kill. He found a way to make the business bigger than any single album, any single artist, or even the company itself. The label could fail, the model could survive. A tank on the album cover was always a strange choice for a record label, but maybe that's exactly why it worked. Tanks aren't built to look pretty, they're built to absorb damage and keep moving, and that turned out to be a pretty good metaphor for No Limit.